Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. Hi there, and welcome to this 4-part series from Art of Procurement in partnership with Sievo, where we look at how today's digital platforms and procurement capabilities can connect to support differentiated decision making, the core element of 10xing the impact of procurement. In our second episode, I'm joined by Heta Pirttijärvi, a product manager at Sievo, to talk about ESG analytics. And I began by asking Heta, why are ESG topics becoming more important and receiving more attention?
Yeah, so I think there's many reasons for this. One of the main reasons, especially here in Europe, is the increasing regulations. So especially things like the CSRD, a lot of companies just need to start reporting their emissions. And that's kind of one of the key drivers. But I think many companies are already ahead of that, really. So they're starting to set, for instance, science-based targets. And here, yes, the pressure is a bit from the regulations, but also from the customers, the consumers, who are really demanding that companies make a change. And I mean, about half of the large companies have already set science-based targets. So if you're not doing that yet, it may really look bad for the consumers. So I think that's one key part. And then a third part really is investors. So just talking to companies who are being invested in, or the investors, that it really is starting to be a key player there as well. So that's definitely one of the pressure parts.
It's interesting you say about the difference between there's regulatory requirements and then kind of these science-based targets, and how a lot of organizations are looking beyond the minimum, which is the regulatory requirements. For those who are not as familiar with what, as you use the terminology of science-based targets, there may be folks in North America, for example, who just haven't been as kind of exposed to that. Could you just explain a little bit about what the difference is between, a regulatory requirement, which I think we're clear on, and what science-based targets are?
Yeah, no, definitely. So Science-Based Targets Initiative is a initiative, like the word says, who basically validate different targets. So companies can kind of apply to have their targets, for instance, being net zero by 2030 validated. And that's kind of the official party that says that, okay, you have an actual target.
Okay, so it's something that has not regulatory, but there's governance around kind of meeting those targets, albeit through a third party. And then so organizations will then, make certain commitments and then have governance that watches and monitors them in their pursuit of hitting those targets.
Yeah, pretty much. Exactly. Yeah.
What do you see are the main obstacles for companies that are struggling with kind of turning the vision that they may have for ESG into actual strategies? I'd love to understand some of the obstacles, but then I know you have such a broad range of exposure to different organizations, how some companies are figuring out how to overcome those obstacles.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think even though there's a lot of different industries, different regions, like for instance, Europe is a bit maybe ahead of, I don't know, Africa or maybe even the US, but I think really it all boils down to two main challenges, and it's data and then like a human challenge. So if we start with the data, I think especially for scope 3, which means the supply chain emissions, it's just really difficult to get the data right. So if we talk about scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, which is kind of how the emissions are split, so they're kind of the company's own emissions, like electricity. And nowadays, it's quite simple to calculate how much emissions come from your electricity. But then if we start to look at the supply chain, we're talking about all of those tens of thousands of suppliers that you're collaborating with. I mean, it's a huge amount of data, and companies just don't have that visibility and maybe don't even understand where to start. And I think that's a real challenge there. And then I guess the other factor is indeed the human challenge. So even if you may even have some of the data parts right, but then you don't have, for instance, the culture, you don't have enough resources to do anything about it because the top management isn't involved or kind of aligned on all of this thinking. So that's kind of the other factor, and both of these need to be there for you to really make decisions based on it.
And so as you think about so let's talk about scope 3 emissions, as an example. You mentioned there, scope 1 is a little easier. You can kind of figure out your own footprint. Where do you go to get that kind of information? Is that information, does it have to be self-reported and aggregated by your supply base? Or are there other sources of data that you can then use to understand what your scope 3 emissions are?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a few ways to look at it, but in general, most companies report and do this whole calculation based on the greenhouse gas protocol, which is kind of an official protocol to do these calculations. And according to that, also, we can kind of approach the situation by first identifying our hotspots. And there we can use average data. So we don't actually need to go and ask the emissions from our 30,000 suppliers separately, which, by the way, they probably won't have that data even to begin with. But really to start with averages. So, okay, I'm buying apples, I'm buying pears, and I'm buying consulting services. Yeah. How much on average are there emissions from 1 kilogram of apples from Germany, for instance?
Interesting.
There's a lot of databases.
So those averages are kind of based on the product or the service that you're buying.
Exactly. And obviously then if you start buying a lot more apples or a lot less apples, or the price increases, or suddenly one of your apple suppliers becomes a lot more sustainable, that really will affect the data a bit. So it's not that accurate as the primary supplier data is, but it's the best place to start and to understand, should you even be focusing on apples or your business travel, for instance.
Interesting. So then you're basically looking and doing a Pareto then to say, based on all the things that I buy, this is minimal, this is where the majority of my the scope 3 emissions are held, and so therefore I should focus on initiatives there, at least to start with.
Exactly.
Now, as we think about ESG, kind of take a step up beyond emissions, for example, are there some other data points or in other kind of goals or targets that you see organizations tracking and monitoring?
Do you mean apart from CO2 emissions?
Yes.
Yeah, I think CO2 or CO2 equivalents are really the key focus point for many organizations, just because there's so much regulations on this. And I think one of our customers put it quite well, that if you're looking at, for instance, human rights issues, it is very difficult to compare, Bangladesh and Sweden, but CO2 emissions is the same in every location. So it's a lot also easier to process and easier to maybe start from that. But obviously there's a lot of different other perspectives like human rights or waste, water use, etc. But I think where most of the focus is right now is the CO2 part.
Yeah, and I guess organizations have gone on a bit of a maturity curve then. So, starting with CO2 emissions, for example, or if you're in an organization that has an awful lot of water usage, that's a natural place to start, but that's just because of the nature of your specific organization. But when you're looking more broadly, that's kind of the best place to start.
Yeah, exactly.
How do you find procurement being involved in, I think in the beginning stages, I think is because a lot of times we hear from procurement folks about, I know this is the right thing to do, but I don't really know where to start. So what role do you see a lot of the leading procurement teams playing in helping with ESG initiatives?
Yeah, it's a good question, because procurement has a huge role in this whole sustainability topic, because if we look at, for instance, scope 3 emissions, it's often 90% of the company emissions, which is a huge amount. And most of that come from the impact that procurement affects. So everything that you buy, all the flights and all the apples that you purchase. So there's a huge role that procurement plays there. And for many companies, I see that the sustainability function, which is often the function who lays the strategy and does the reporting, is doing a really close collaboration with procurement, and often the procurement is the one actually driving the initiatives and just kind of communicating back and forth with sustainability in a close way rather than just working in silos. And I think that's one of the key points that we see the leading companies doing.
And how can we be proactive? So I think about, when you're doing reporting, sometimes reporting is looking at historical data to get a snapshot of where you are today, but then it's around taking action. How are procurement teams being proactive in then managing or reducing scope 3 emissions, whether it's through sourcing exercises, whether it's through continuous improvement, any kind of tips that you can share that you see?
Yeah, there's a lot, but I think one key thing that a lot of the companies that I've been working with have also identified is just having the right tools in place. So a lot of companies are still doing all of this calculation in Excel. And if you're doing it in Excel, I mean, I understand it's a very good place to start for sure, but it really is often looking at that, like you said, kind of backwards data. And it's really hard to make decisions based on that. So you would need really to be able to make those decisions, you would have to have data that's updated on a continuous basis. So if you make a purchase with a different supplier, you actually see that data on a, for instance, monthly data update, and you can actually see when you start adding those supplier specific emissions into your calculations, how they affect your data, etc. So I think that's really one of the key things, just having that tool that can even enable you to get there and not limit you in your progress.
Yeah, and so those updates then are, I guess, against a couple of dimensions. One is spend. So what are the products and services that you're buying, and how's that changing? And therefore, how is that changing kind of your scope 3 footprint and volumes associated with that as well? And then specific suppliers. I'm imagining as being kind of, as that changes, like and the averages that I was thinking about. As averages may change based on product and service types as well. That would play into that continuous update.
Exactly. And I think out of those three, the spend data is the one that updates the most. Yeah. So probably your suppliers will maybe have like an annual data update, but your spend can update basically on a daily basis what you're buying. So indeed, just having all of those in an updated manner and in the same place really helps.
Thanks for listening in to today's episode, part of our 4-part podcast series focused on driving differentiated decision-making, one of our core pillars of 10x procurement, in partnership with Sievo. To listen back to the entire series, go to artofprocurement.com/decision series. That's artofprocurement.com/decision series.